Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are digging up our dahlia tubers, and it is just so crazy how quickly this area changed in just 2 weeks. So we started to kind of get our cold nights about 2 weeks ago, and it happened so fast. Like I was so surprised at how quickly they just kind of shriveled and were kind of mushy, and it's just one of those things that is really sad when the time comes. I know it happens every year, and I do love this time of year because you kind of really get to reflect on your garden, and you kind of think about what worked, what didn't, what you enjoyed, what you want to change next year. But it's always so sad when the dahlias go, just because they made such a big impact in our garden, and so to see them gone is just kind of like shocking, like, oh my gosh. So anyways, today I am going to go over how to dig, store, and divide your dahlia tuber. So I'm going to show you guys the most common ways that a lot of people like to do when they're storing and dividing and digging up their dahlias. But really what it comes down to is just what your preference is, right? Like everybody is going to have a different way or a different technique. And it also depends on where you live, because something that might work for me and might not work for you, or if you're in a warmer climate, or if you're in a drier climate or a cooler climate. So remember, I live in Portland, Oregon, so we garden in zone 8B. So we have very wet winters. So in the past, I have left my dahlia tubers in the ground. The only reason why I am going to be digging them up this time is because we are redoing our whole backyard. So the dahlias aren't going to be going in the same space that they were in this year. So that's why I have to dig them all up. I'm going to be dividing all of them. So I'm super excited to see kind of what the tubers look like. I do have some that have been in their areas for 2 years, and then most of them were planted during the springtime. So I'm excited to see the size difference between the clumps of tubers. Anyways, let me show you guys what you're going to need for today's video, and then we will start talking about digging, washing, labeling, dividing, and we'll just kind of break everything down step by step. So here we go. Okay, so here are the things that you guys are going to need for today's video. Now, you don't need all of this. I just have extra things out here because I want to give you guys some different options in what you can use for your dahlia tubers. So I have vermiculite. I have pine shaving. So this is just wood shaving. You will need either a wooden crate, a cardboard box, or you can use a plastic crate, which I'll show you guys these in a minute. You will need a spading fork or a hay fork. You can get some bypass pruners and some snips. These are the ones that I like to use a lot. You will need some loppers, some cleaning solution, some disinfectant. So I'm just going to be using rubbing alcohol. I have a carpenter's knife. So this is going to be for splitting the dahlias. So you can actually order a dahlia dividing knife, but it's basically a carpenter's knife. So we have this, we have some pens, some Sharpies, a plastic container, some flagging tape, and then some newspaper. Well, this is just regular packing paper, or you can use newspaper. So I think this is what we're going to be needing. If we do need anything extra, then I will talk to you about it in the video. So let's go ahead and start talking about digging your dahlias and when you should be doing that. So as you guys can see, I've already cut back all of our dahlias. I actually did this yesterday. I always like to cut mine back a day before I am ready to dig them up. So cutting them back is, I know a lot of people, if yours are starting to look brown and dead, you want to cut them right away. But the problem with that is if you leave them cut and you're not going to dig them up for a while, and if you live in an area that gets a lot of rain, what happens is your dahlia, they can fill up with water. So the stems will fill up with water. You can see that they're hollow. And that could potentially rot. So if you have dahlias in your garden right now and you just don't like the way they look and you want to cut them back because obviously they don't look the prettiest right now, you can, but I would just find a way to cover the stems up so they're not open to getting a lot of water in there. So I will show you guys, if you are going to leave them in the ground, I'll show you what to do for that. But if you are going to cut them back right now, but you plan on digging them up, again, I would just try to find a way to cover them up. You can use like aluminum foil to cover up the stems. That way water doesn't get in there and cause rot. So you typically want to cut your tubers back about 2 weeks after killing frost or mid-November in our climate. Of course, if you live in a warmer climate, you probably want to wait a little bit longer until it gets a little bit cooler. And if you live in a cooler climate where you're already getting, those really cold temperatures, then you probably want to do it a little bit early. But for us here in the Northwest, we typically do it the second week of November. So you never want to dig up your tubers too early, because remember, your dahlias just spent a lot of energy producing beautiful blooms and not a lot of energy in tuber production. So by waiting a couple of weeks after killing frost, all of that energy is now going back into tuber production. So the longer you can wait, the better it is, and the better tubers you're going to get. So if I were to do it like the day after that a cold frost or a killing frost came, then my tubers might not be as strong as they would be had I waited a couple of weeks. So don't rush to get them out of the ground too quickly. And if you have any questions about your zone, it's always good to ask local nurseries. You can also, I'm going to list down a lot of resources for you guys in the description down below. So make sure you guys go to those if you have any questions. But Florette's got some really great articles. Swan Island has really great videos. And I'll just list other resources for you guys to use. So if you have any questions about your specific zone, try to refer to those first. If you can't find any answers, just again, comment down below and I'll make sure to try to help you out. So we've already had a killing frost. So it is like the perfect time to dig ours up. So again, it kind of goes back, I think a lot of this kind of has to do with where you live. So if you live in a warmer climate, you can get away with not digging up your tubers at all. But you do want to give them a 3-month resting period between every bloom cycle. So if you're like down in Florida or California and you're growing dahlias, then you want to make sure you cut them back once it gets a little bit cooler. Just that way they have a little break before blooming cycles, because they really do need that. All right, so now we're going to be digging them up. So I'm only going to dig a few up just because it might take a while to dig them all up. So for this process, you want to use either a hay fork or a spading fork like I showed you guys. And the only reason why you want to do that is because if you use a shovel, you have a bigger chance of puncturing your tubers. So with the fork, you're able to kind of dig around the tubers, and you might puncture one or two, but it won't be as bad as using a shovel. So that's what I like to do. And it also allows some of the soil to fall off the tubers when you're digging them up. So it kind of makes the process a little bit easier. So let's dig a few up and then we will get them all washed up. Okay, so here's a dahlia that I haven't cut back yet. Like I mentioned, I did cut the other ones already. The ones that were in the landscape I've already dug up and stored. And the other ones here in the cutting patch, I just cut down yesterday, which actually I'll throw up a quick clip so you guys can see how I did that. But when you're cutting your dahlias back, you want to leave about 46 inches of the stalk left, just to kind of help facilitate digging up the tuber. So that's the only reason why we do that. So if you're going to cut them back to dig them up, let me set my camera down to show you what you do. And it's nice to use loppers for this because a lot of them can be a little bit too thick for your bypass to go around. So I like to use the loppers. So we'll just leave it a little bit left on there so we can grab onto them when we're digging them up. And again, so you'll just leave about 46 inches left to help dig them up. Now, if you live in a climate where you can get away with leaving yours underground, I still like to cover mine up to protect them. So I have some over here that I have left in the ground for a couple of years. So we'll dig a couple of those up today to see how the clumps look versus the ones that we grew this year. But if you are going to leave yours underground, I like to clean up the area just like this. I will sprinkle some slug bait down because we have a lot of slug problems here and I don't want to get them anywhere near our dahlias. So I'll put a little bit of slug bait down, and then I will cover this whole area up with plastic and just put some mulch on top just to kind of insulate it a little bit more. So if you do leave yours underground, you want to cut those stalks down all the way down to the ground. So I go down like very close to where it starts getting a little bit woody, just like that. You can see that's not hollow. Versus if you leave it like this, they're still pretty hollow, and they can get water in there. So you see how this one's different. So I just cut it all the way down like that. I'll sprinkle my bait down, I'll cover with plastic, and then I'll just put mulch on top. That way they're not gonna get too wet and the tubers aren't going to rot by staying in here all winter long. So that's my process if you're gonna keep them in the ground. Okay, so this is the other dahlia that I left intact because I wanted to show you guys this. So this is actually crown gall, and it's just a disease caused by bacteria. So if any of your dahlias have this, which this is pretty extensive and it's pretty rare. So I've never had any of this happen to my dahlias before. I did reach out to a couple of growers and they said that this was pretty big. They haven't seen one this big before. But if any of yours have crown gall, then you want to make sure to dispose of that dahlia. You don't want to put it in your compost. You don't want to put it in your yard debris bin. Just get rid of it in the trash. Also, when you're digging this up or you're cutting it down, you want to make sure you're cleaning all of your tools before you touch any of your other plants. So I think it'll be fun to kind of see this dug up to see what the tubers look like. But right afterwards, I want to make sure that I'm going to be clean them all down with a disinfectant because we don't want to spread any of this to any other plants. So that's what that looks like. And I just thought it was so wild. And I wanted to show you guys how crazy this looks. Isn't that wild? And when you're digging, you want to make sure to dig kind of away from the center. You don't want to go right here because you are going to be puncturing your tubers. Try to go as far back as you can and get in there. And just like that. Okay, so let's dig up a clump that has been here for a couple of years to see how they differ. All right, let's get a couple of these all washed up. Look at this. Okay, so now let's go ahead and wash some of our clumps. Now, again, make sure that you are bringing your tags everywhere you go with your tubers, just because you don't want to lose track of which variety you're processing. So everywhere I go, I'm going to take this little tag with me. That way I can I can process them and not lose track of which variety I am working on. When you're washing your tubers, you want to make sure that you use a nozzle that has the jet setting, because you really want to rinse away all of that soil, because soil has a lot of microorganisms. And so when we're storing our clumps, we want to make sure that they're completely clean. That way there's not going to be any opportunities for any little critters or anything to affect the way your tubers are being stored. So let's go ahead and wash this one, and then we will talk about storing and dividing next. Okay, so now that we've cut down our dahlias and we've dug them up and we've washed them, we're going to let them sit for a day before we store them. So what I like to do is I'll bring them inside for a day, I'll let them dry off, and then I'll start storing them. You want to make sure you don't skip this process because you don't want them to be wet when you store them. And when you do let them dry for a day, you want to make sure you do it inside, or you can bring it into your garage, just somewhere where they're protected, because if you leave them out, the tubers are too tender, they're not going to make it. So let's talk about the storage containers that you can use for your dahlias. So for your storage containers, you have a few options. So you can use a wood crate or like an apple crate. You can use a cardboard box, which a lot of people do use cardboard boxes. You can use a plastic crate, which I love to use these collapsible crates just because they don't take up a lot of room once I'm done using them. So I will link down these below if you want to get some of these, but they're awesome to use in the garden or inside, and they just store really nicely when you're all done. So this is how they open up, and then once you're done, you just collapse them and store them. And then this plastic container you can use if you're going to divide them and store them right now. So we'll talk a little bit more about dividing them now versus dividing them in the springtime. So once you've selected your container that you're going to be storing your clumps or your tubers, let's talk about the medium in which you're going to store them in. So I know a lot of people use different materials, and some of them are a little bit controversial versus others, depending on who you are, or different dahlia farmers have different preferences. So the three main ones that a lot of people like to use is either wood shaving, you can use vermiculite, or you can use peat moss. So with the peat moss, I know a lot of people like to stay away from it just because it's not the most sustainable material to use, but I think you can make it sustainable if you use it year after year after year. So if you're not discarding it, once you use it once, I think you could potentially just make it sustainable that way. So with the peat moss, if you do get a fresh bag, it'll be all ready to go that season. If you're going to be storing your peat moss for the following year, you just want to make sure that you moisten it so it's not so dusty. Just because you do want your medium to have a little bit of moisture when you're storing your tubers or your clumps, because you don't want them to be completely dry in a dry medium. So they won't make it, they'll shrivel up, and they won't make it during their storage period. So I like to use, I think cost wise, I think the wood shaving is the most cost effective. Just because, for example, like this 10 cubic feet of wood shaving I got for about $10 versus this 2 cubic feet of vermiculite I got for $28. So, you kind of have to play around with like, what's your budget? What do you want to spend? I do like using vermiculite for a lot of things. So for me, it's not a big deal, buying a lot of it because I know I'm going to be using it. So I think today we will be using the vermiculite. Now with vermiculite, it is also a pretty dry medium. So we're going to make sure to moisten it a little bit before we use it. So you can go ahead and do like a 5-gallon bucket of vermiculite and a cup of water. That's what Swan Island recommends. And you guys know Swan Island, they're a place where I get a lot of our tubers from. They are actually about 25 minutes away from our house. So we're pretty lucky that we get to go there often and see their farm. And we took you guys on a tour of their farm actually a couple of months back, and we'll definitely go back again next year. So anyways, I'm really excited to take you guys back, but let's go ahead and prep our vermiculite, and then we will talk about how to store them. So after our tubers are nice and dry, before I store them, I just come in and I clean them all up. So I just cut all of these little roots just like this. And I just make sure that there's nothing unwanted in here. So make sure it's nice and clean. So this clump is ready to be stored. So before we store our tubers, we are going to label them. So I like to use just flag tape. I think it's just fast and easy, and it's pretty inexpensive. You can buy this at the hardware store, or you can just order some online. So I'll just take a strip, and then I will write down the variety. Just like that. So when I have a dahlia that I have several varieties, I'll just store them together. So this whole crate that we're going to be using today, I will store the same variety because I have so many of the Park Princess. So what I like to do is I'll take the tag that I use to put to label them in the ground. I will put that inside the crate with it, and then I will tie this little tag to the crate on the outside. That way, if for some reason this gets the tag gets misplaced or rips off, I have a backup to know which variety is in here. Okay, so if you're going to be storing your tubers as clumps, you want to make sure to line your container with paper. You can use newspaper, or you can use like packing paper. I save all of my paper from Home Goods, and I always ask them for a little bit extra because I know I use it for these types of projects. So I'm just going to line our containers with maybe like 5 to 10 sheets, just like this. just to make sure they have a little bit of protection. And you would do the same process if you're using a box or a cardboard box or like a wood container or any other container that you're going to be using it for. But you don't want to do it if you're going to be using the plastic containers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we have a good layer just like this. So it's nice and lined. And now we're going to do a layer of the vermiculite. So you want to do about 2 inches. Okay, now that we have our 2 inches of storing medium, whether that's going to be the vermiculite, the peat moss, or the wood shaving, we're going to set our clumps of tubers in here. So the only thing is, remember, you want to wait a day before you put them away. We don't want to store them when they're still wet. So I do have some little clumps here. Now these were grown in little containers, like a 1-gallon container, just because I meant to transplant them into the landscape and I just never got around to it. So these clumps are so much smaller than the ones we dug up today. So this one was in the ground. This one was in the container. I grew them at the same time. I planted both at the same time. I completely forgot, like I think there was 5 of them that I completely forgot to transplant into the landscape, and they just stayed in their little container. So that's totally fine. It doesn't matter. They're still going to be viable for next spring. So we want to just lay them out, and we don't want them to touch. So we have to lay them out just like this. And let me get you guys a close-up of what this looks like. Okay, so this is what they look like. Now what I will do next is just cover them all up just like this. So they're nice and tucked away. I'll do another layer of paper. Or if you're using the burlap, you want to do a next layer of burlap. And then you will add more of your medium. Just like this. And then continue adding your clumps. Just like that. And then you'll just continue that process. And once your container is completely full, I will fold everything back like this. And take them to the areas where they're going to be stored. So let's talk about where you're going to be storing your tubers. Okay, so now that we have our clumps all packed up, we're going to talk about where to store them until it's time to divide and plant them. So you want to make sure that you are keeping your dahlia tubers or clumps in an area that stays between 40 to 50 degrees. Ideally, you want to store them in an area that has high humidity and stays between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what, about 4 degrees Celsius. So for us, that means we can get away with storing them in our shed because that area doesn't get that cold. It usually stays between 40 and 50 degrees. The way you can check is to just put a thermometer in there and then just check periodically how cool or warm that area is. You could also store them in your attic. You can store them in your crawl space. You can store them in your garage. The only thing is, if you are going to store them in your garage, and it's concrete. Remember, concrete pulls a lot of moisture, so you just want to make sure that you're checking on them at least once a month to make sure that they're still okay. Now for me, I do notice sometimes that the storage medium does dry out. So what I like to do is just mist with like water the storage medium when I'm checking on the tubers once a month. So just kind of keep that in mind. And what I like to do is just set a calendar reminder on my phone for every month to check on them until I'm ready to take them out, divide, and get them planted. So just keep that in mind. And when you check on them, that's a really good time to also check to see if there's any rot, because if there is, then you want to make sure to remove that clump or remove that tuber. And that also gives you the opportunity to see the medium. So if you see that the medium is dry, you want to go ahead and just mist it like I mentioned before, just with some regular water. So you're not misting the tuber, you're just misting the medium that they're in. Okay, so now we've cut our dahlias, we've dug them up, we've washed them, we've let them dry for a day, and we've stored them in our containers as clumps. Now, you can do it that way. The other way of doing this is dividing them and storing them as individual tubers. So let's talk about dividing them and how I would store them if I was going to divide all of them right now versus the springtime. The great thing about dividing them now is that that's just one less project that you have to worry about in the springtime. Plus, I think it saves a lot of room, because a lot of the clumps that we dig up, and maybe you will find this as well, is that they are pretty big, like this one. So in order to store them as clumps, I'm going to need a lot of boxes and a lot of space to store them, versus if I divide them into individual tubers, I can store a lot of them in a container similar to this. Because remember, just because this one has a lot of tubers, that doesn't mean that all of these are going to be viable ones to store. So when we divide them, maybe we'll get 4 or 5 out of this whole big clump. So that's just something to consider. If space is an issue, then I think it's a really good time to divide them right now. And again, it's one less thing to do in the springtime. The great thing about dividing in the springtime is that some of the eyes, which I'll show you guys, I'll talk to you guys a little bit about the anatomy of a dahlia tuber. But there's an eye, which is just a swollen node, which is where where the sprouts come from. Well, in the springtime, when you're getting ready to plant your dahlias, you can take them out of storage, kind of leave them in an area that comes to about 70 degrees, and you'll see that they'll start sprouting just ever so slightly. So that makes division really easy. Right now, if you're going to divide like the next day after you've dug them, you still have a good visible view of their eyes. But if you wait like a couple of weeks and then you're trying to divide them, then it could be a little bit trickier to see where those eyes are. So it kind of is preference. I don't think one is better than the other. I think it's just what you want to do. Do you have the time to do it now? Or is it something that you want to wait for to possibly see those sprouts come up? And that will make dividing them a lot easier. So it's up to you. So I will show you guys how to divide them. Now, if you are going to divide them and store them, you want to make sure to give them about a day to heal over before you put them in storage. So just keep that in mind as well. So let me get the camera close, and then we will do kind of a close-up of how to divide them. And then I'll show you how that process is like. Okay, so I will throw up an illustration of a dahlia for you guys to see, but you're basically going to have an eye, you're going to have the neck, and then you're going to have the body. So the eye is just a node, like a swollen node, and that's where the sprouts come from. So in order for a tuber to be viable, you have to have an eye. Even if, for example, even if this was a little bit dinged or cut, this could still be a viable tuber as long as I still had the eye on there. So I am going to try to give you guys a close-up. I brought a pen to kind of outline the eye and where you would divide. I'm going to show you guys how to do this a couple of times, but if you want me to do a video where we divide a lot of clumps together, just let me know down in the comments and I'll make sure to do one for you guys as well. So let me go ahead and outline this one for you guys to see. So right over here is where we have an eye. So it's just this little swollen node. So I would cut this one just like that. So let's go ahead and divide this one. This one doesn't have an eye. This one also doesn't have an eye. And so here is okay, so you see here's the eye, here's the neck, and then here's the rest of the tuber. So this is one viable tuber right here. Okay, so here's another clump, and here is an eye right over here. So you can see it's almost like a little pimple. It's like this little swelling right here. So that's where the growth comes out of. So we will divide it just like this. And it really is kind of a practice thing. I mean, it's hard to tell if you're a beginner, and sometimes the eyes will be on the underside of the clump. So let's go ahead and cut this one as well. Okay, so here's another tuber, and I know this one is really small, but don't judge something by its size. This tuber will produce a beautiful dahlia, and their size doesn't have anything to do with whether they're going to produce a beautiful dahlia or not. Different varieties of dahlias produce small tubers. Different varieties also produce large tubers. Some produce more tubers than others, so don't worry about the size of your tuber. This one will be just fine. Okay, so from this one tuber that I planted this spring, I got 5 additional tubers. So with the mother tuber, I just go ahead and toss. You can replant this one next year. It's not going to do a very good job at producing extra tubers, but it will produce flowers. So you can toss it. It's just it's going to be your weakest one out of the bunch. So I just toss mine. And you can always tell by which one is the mother tuber because it looks a lot darker than the other one. So you can see these are all fresh tubers here. And then this is the mother one. This is the mother one that we planted this springtime. So again, you can keep it. It's not going to really produce a lot of tubers, but it will produce flowers. But I just go ahead and toss the mother one every year and just keep all of the babies that it produced. So I do love using this tool to divide them, especially on the underside, because this hook can really get in there. So just keep this in mind. If you're having a hard time dividing your dahlias, give this guy a try. The other great thing about dividing your tubers now is that they cut like potatoes versus if you wait in the springtime, they're going to be a little bit harder and almost leathery to cut them. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding whether to divide yours now or later. And again, what a great investment that these flowers are, because out of that one tuber, we got 5 extra ones. So if you're looking to grow your collection of dahlias or the amount that you have in your garden, like it's such an amazing thing to do is divide them, and you get so much more year after year. So that's great. So let me show you how I would store these if I was going to divide them now. Okay, so if you're going to store them as tubers and you want to save a lot of room, this is a great way to do it. And actually Florette taught us how to do this. So what I like to do is you'll do your layer of vermiculite or whatever storage medium you're using. You will lay out your tubers. Let's clean them a little bit. Okay, so you will lay out your tubers after a day that they've had to heal. You don't want to store them when their cuts are still fresh. Just let them heal. And then you will lay them out just like this. And then you'll do another layer of your storage medium. Just like that, and then continue piling them on. And now with the plastic container, you'll just leave it a little bit open. That way it has plenty of air circulating through, and you'll store it just like this in the same temperature and other settings that we talked about. Okay, so it just started to rain, so I just brought everything onto the deck really quick. But I just wanted to go over a few more things with you guys. So if you have potted dahlias and you want to keep them in their containers, that's totally fine. You just want to make sure you keep them in an area that's going to be protected over the winter time. So you'll just cut them down to the soil level like we did before. And for us, we'll just keep them on our deck. They're insulated by the soil, so I don't have to worry about them getting too cold. But if we do have really low temperatures that are going to dip below 40 and 50 degrees, then I will probably just put them in the shed. So you can do that. Just make sure they're being protected. For labeling, make sure you label your dahlias. I know this seems kind of like a simple thing to remember, but it's unbelievable how quickly you can forget when you're dividing them or storing them, how easy it is to forget labeling them. So just find a system that works for you guys. And I also wanted to show you something that I like to do for labeling. So I always laminate the dahlia names and the pictures that come with the dahlias when you buy them. So, they always have like a little picture and some instructions on the back of how to plant your dahlias. So I always find this so helpful, especially when I am planting them in the springtime, because sometimes you forget. And although I do keep like hundreds of pictures of all of my flowers on my phone and on my computer, sometimes it's nice just to quickly refer to something like this. So I always laminate mine, or you can take your own pictures and print them out and laminate them. I also like to put little notes on the back, so you can put things like, did you like them? Did you not? Did you want to, plant them in a different area? You can kind of just write your own notes on how much you like them or you didn't, or what time of the year that you planted them, or what year you planted them. So it's always fun just to make like those little mental notes. So I just thought I would share that with you guys. Okay, so now for your tools, if you don't want to buy the dividing knife that I have, that's totally fine. You can just use your pruners or snips. You just want to make sure you're cleaning them between each clump that you're dividing or storing. Just because it's always nice to kind of do preventative or take preventative measures not to cross-contaminate anything. So I always make it a habit to clean off my pruners or snips. And I just use rubbing alcohol. You can use a little bit of bleach with water. So you would do 10 parts water to 1 part bleach, and just kind of dip your tool in there, wipe it dry, and then move on to the next one. So it's just really important to do that. If you are going to get the carpenter's knife to divide, I highly recommend you sharpen them because they are so dull, even when they're brand new. So just make sure you have something to sharpen them with. But again, I think the pruners work just fine. The snips work just fine. I like the hook on the carpenter's knife because it can really get in between the tubers in ones that are really tight together. So just keep that in mind when you're dividing yours. Okay, so for your storage medium, if you have any reservations about peat moss, then just don't use it. You can use vermiculite, you can use wood shavings. Those are really good alternatives and they work really well. I just make sure that you check on them once a month to make sure they're not completely dry. Just because if it is, again, your tubers are not going to do well. So I always make a habit to just put a reminder on my phone for once a month to check on them. I come with a little spray bottle, and if I feel that they're really dry, that the medium is really dry, then I just mist it ever so slightly, just to make sure there's enough moisture in there so the tubers don't dry out completely. So when you're storing your tubers, you could also use a fungicide powder just to take extra precautions so your tubers don't develop any fungus. But honestly, I've never had to use it. I know a lot of people don't use it and they don't find an issue with storing them the way we discussed today. But you can buy like sulfur or fungicide powder and just kind of dust your tubers before putting them to storage. But it's not one of those steps that I find critical, but again, if you just want to take an extra precaution, you can totally do that. But again, I found that if I just let them dry completely before storing them, I don't have any issues with them that way. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope that was helpful. Again, I know there's just tons of ways to do this process, but I hope the ones that I showed you today were easy to follow, and maybe you learned something new today that you hadn't known before. If you guys have any questions for me, please just write them down in the comment section and I will answer them for you. But yeah, I'm really excited to get the other ones dug up. I'm really excited just to see how big those clumps are. I was pretty surprised at how the ones that we pulled out today, how huge they were. And those are just 1 year growth. So I'm definitely excited to divide them and see what they look like and how many viable tubers I actually get from each clump. But anyways, thank you guys for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Okay, so there it is. The mass actually just broke right off. But look at how huge that is. See what was attached right here? Here's the mother tuber. So let me just break that off, and there's still some growing over here. But here's the mother tuber, and it was just attached right to it. There's 2 masses. Look at that. Isn't that crazy? Let me know if you guys have ever seen this before.